Do you think you can outsmart the system? You're nothing but another lost case? The words echoed through the prestigious federal courthouse as a seasoned prosecutor pointed his finger at a young woman who sat calmly at the defendant's table, accused of a crime that would destroy her future. All eyes were on her, waiting for the inevitable conviction. But as the tension reached its peak, the courtroom doors swung open and an unexpected figure stepped in. Someone with undeniable authority and credentials that would change everything. What secrets had been hidden, and how would this shocking revelation expose the corruption that ran deeper than anyone imagined? Stay tuned for the 8th story that will leave you speechless. The morning mist clung to the imposing facade of the Daniel Patrick Moynihan United States Courthouse in Lower Manhattan, its neoclassical columns stretching toward the gray October sky like sentinels of justice. The building's limestone walls had witnessed countless legal battles, but few as complex as the case about to unfold within its hallowed halls. Elena Rodriguez pulled her navy blazer tighter around her as she climbed the courthouse steps, each footfall echoing against the marble with a hollow resonance that seemed to mirror the emptiness she felt in her chest. At 26, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that belied the chaos swirling around her life. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple bun and behind wire-rimmed glasses. Her brown eyes held a mixture of determination and fear that only those who had faced impossible odds could understand. The federal building loomed above her. It's imposing. Architecture designed to intimidate and inspire respect for the law. But as Elena approached the main entrance, she couldn't help but feel that the very institution meant to protect justice had turned against her. The weight of the charges against her conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and corruption pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was thick with tension and the sterile scent of polished marble and industrial cleaning products. Elena tried to ignore the whispers that followed her through the main hallway, the pointing fingers and judgmental stares from court staff, lawyers and spectators who had already convicted her in their minds. She had become a symbol, a cautionary. Tales splashed across newspaper headlines and cable news segments. Young public defender accused of corruption, trust betrayed, the fall of Elena Rodriguez and another lawyer gone bad. She paused outside courtroom 15A, the heavy oak doors bearing the seal of the United States. District Court for the Southern District of New York. Behind those doors waited a jury of her peers, though she wondered if any of them could truly understand the impossible position she had found herself in. The irony wasn't lost on Hershey, who had dedicated her career to defending the accused, now found herself on the other side of the equation, fighting for her own freedom. Elena had always believed in the justice system, even when it seemed stacked. Against her clients, growing up in the Bronx, she had seen firsthand how the law could be used as both a shield and a weapon. Her parents, both immigrants, who had worked multiple jobs to put her through school, had instilled in her a deep respect for education and the rule of law. When she graduated from Columbia Law School, she could have joined any number of prestigious white shoe firms, but instead she chose to work as a public defender, representing those who couldn't afford to buy justice. The path that led her to this moment had begun 6 months ago. She was assigned to defend Marcus Williams, a young man accused of drug trafficking in what seemed like a routine case. But as Elena delved deeper into the evidence, she began to uncover inconsistencies, planted evidence, coerced testimony, and a pattern of corruption that reached into the highest levels of the district attorney's office. When she tried to expose what she had discovered, the system turned against her with swift and brutal efficiency. Suddenly, she found herself under investigation for the very crime she had been trying to expose. Evidence that she had been collecting to prove the conspiracy was twisted and used against her, painting her as a corrupt lawyer who had been working with drug dealers to undermine prosecutions. The memory of her arrest still sent shivers down her spine. Federal agents had surrounded her apartment at dawn, their badges glinting in the early morning light as they placed her in handcuffs in full view of her neighbors. The perp walk, the booking photos, the arraignment tit, all felt like a nightmare from which she couldn't wake up. Elena took a deep breath and pushed open the courtroom doors. The gallery was packed with spectators, reporters, and legal professionals, all eager to witness what promised to be a high-profile trial. At the prosecution table sat Assistant United States Attorney Richard Blackstone, a man whose reputation for ruthless efficiency had earned him the nickname the executioner among defense lawyers. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his expensive suit impeccable, and his cold blue eyes radiated the confidence of someone who had never lost a case. Beside Blackstone sat District Attorney Patricia Hawthorne, a woman whose political ambitions were barely concealed behind her facade of righteous indignation. Hawthorne had built her career on high-profile prosecutions and had no intention of letting a corrupt public defender tarnish her spotless record. Her presence at the prosecution table was unusual for a case of this type. But Elena understood the message. The full weight of the system was arrayed against her. At the defense table, Elena's attorney, Michael Chen, was already reviewing his notes. Chen was one of the few lawyers willing to take her case, and even he had warned her that their chances of success were slim. The evidence against her was circumstantial, but compelling, and the prosecution had painted a narrative that was both simple and damning. Elena Rodriguez was a corrupt lawyer who had sold out her oath for money. As Elena took her seat, she noticed the jury filing into their box. 12 faces, each one a potential arbiter of her fate. They looked like ordinary people: a teacher, a plumber, a retired nurse, a small business owner, but Elena knew that their ordinary appearance masked the extraordinary power they held over her future. She tried to read their expressions, searching for any sign of sympathy or open-mindedness, but most avoided her gaze. Judge Margaret Sullivan entered the courtroom with a stern expression that had intimidated lawyers for over 2 decades. Her black robes seemed to flow around her like a dark cloud, and her piercing green eyes surveyed the packed courtroom with the authority of someone accustomed to absolute control. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of years on the bench and countless difficult decisions. "The court will come to order," Judge Sullivan announced, her gavel echoing through the silent courtroom. Case number 23CR891, United States of America versus Elena Rodriguez. Elena stood as her name was called, her legs feeling unsteady beneath her. This was at the moment that would determine whether she would spend the next decade in federal prison or walk free to rebuild her shattered life. The charges against her carried a maximum sentence of 20 years, effectively ending any chance of continuing her legal career or having a normal life. The opening statements began with Blackstone rising from his chair like a predator sensing weakness. His voice was smooth and confident as he addressed the jury, painting Elena as a calculating criminal who had betrayed the very system she had sworn to uphold. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Blackstone began, his voice carrying clearly through the courtroom, "what you will see in this trial is a betrayal of the most fundamental kind. The defendant, Elena Rodriguez, was entrusted with one of the most sacred responsibilities in our legal system, the defense of those accused of crimes. But instead of upholding her oath, she chose to corrupt that trust for personal gain." Elena clenched her fists under the table as Blackstone continued. "His character assassination." He spoke as if he knew her personally, as if he had witnessed her supposed crimes firsthand. The prosecution's narrative was compelling in its simplicity. Elena had been recruited by a drug trafficking organization to undermine prosecutions from within, providing inside information about investigations and helping criminals escape justice. "The evidence will show," Blackstone continued, pacing in front of the jury box, "that Ms. Rodriguez received substantial payments from known drug dealers in exchange for sensitive information about ongoing investigations." She used her position as a public defender to access confidential law enforcement databases, gathering intelligence that she then sold to the highest bidder. This is not the story of a dedicated public servant gone astray. This is the story of a calculated criminal who saw an opportunity and seized it. When it was Michael Chen's turn to address the jury, his approach was markedly different. Blackstone had been theatrical and aggressive. Chen was measured and thoughtful, speaking to the jury as if they were colleagues rather than adversaries. "Members of the jury," Chen began, his voice calm but firm. "What Mr. Blackstone has just described is indeed a serious crime, if it were true. But as you'll learn over the course of this trial, Elena Rodriguez is not the criminal in this story. She's the whistleblower, the truth teller, who discovered a conspiracy so deep and so damaging that those involved were willing to destroy an innocent woman to protect themselves. Chun's words sparked a murmur through the courtroom, and Elena felt a small glimmer of hope. Her attorney continued, outlining their defense strategy and explaining how Elena had stumbled upon evidence of corruption while doing her job as a public defender. Elena Rodriguez did receive payments, Chen admitted, but not from drug dealers. Those payments were made by federal law enforcement agencies as part of a confidential informant agreement. Ms. Rodriguez was working undercover to expose corruption within the district attorney's office, and when she got too close to the truth, she was framed for the very crimes she was trying to expose. The courtroom erupted in whispers and gasps. Lena noticed several jurors leaning forward in their seats, their expressions shifting from skepticism to curiosity. Even Judge Sullivan raised an eyebrow, though her face remained impassive. Blackstone immediately objected, claiming that Chen's statements were inflammatory and unsupported by evidence. The two lawyers engaged in a heated sidebar with the judge, their voices low, but their body language tense. Elena watched the exchange with growing anxiety, knowing that the judge's ruling could significantly impact their defense strategy. After several minutes of discussion, Judge Sullivan returned to her bench and addressed the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, you are to disregard any statements about federal law enforcement involvement until such evidence is properly presented in court. Mr. Chen, you will confine your opening statement to facts that you can prove." Chen nodded respectfully, but Elena could see the frustration in his eyes. The prosecution had been allowed to paint her as a criminal without constraint, but her defense was being limited at every turn. It was becoming clear that this trial would be an uphill battle fought on uneven ground. The first day of testimony began with the prosecution calling Detective Ray Morrison to the stand. Morrison was a 20-year veteran of the NYPD who had been involved in several of the drug investigations that Elena had allegedly compromised. His testimony was carefully scripted and damaging, describing how confidential information about police operations had been leaked to drug dealers. Detective Morrison, Blackstone asked, his voice projecting authority, "In your professional opinion, could these leaks have come from anyone other than someone with access to law enforcement databases?" Morrison shook his head gravely. "No, sir. The information that was leaked was specific and detailed the kind of intelligence that only comes from inside sources. Someone with official access was feeding information to the other side." During cross-examination, Chen attempted to show that Morrison had no direct evidence linking Elena to the leaks, but the detective's testimony had already done its damage. The jury heard a detailed account of how law enforcement operations had been compromised, and Elena's name was prominently featured throughout Morrison's testimony. As the day wore on, Elena found herself studying the faces of the jurors, trying to gauge their reactions to the testimony. Some seemed convinced by the prosecution's narrative, nodding along with Morrison's account of the leaked information. Others appeared more skeptical, particularly an older woman in the back row who kept glancing at Elena with what looked like sympathy. During the lunch recess, Lena and Chen huddled in a small conference room adjacent to the courtroom. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across Chen's face as he reviewed his notes, his expression grim. "It's going exactly as I expected," Chen said, not looking up from his papers. "They're building a circumstantial case brick by brick. Each piece of evidence seems innocent enough on its own, but together they form a compelling narrative." Elena stared out the small window at the city below, watching pedestrians hurry along the sidewalk, each one living their own life, free from the weight of federal criminal charges. "What about our evidence?" she asked. "When do we get to tell our side of the story?" Chen finally looked up, his eyes reflecting the same exhaustion Elena felt. "Soon, but I have to warn you, some of our key evidence has been classified by the government. We're fighting with one hand tied behind our back." The afternoon session brought more prosecution witnesses, each one adding another layer to the case against Elena. A financial analyst testified about suspicious deposits in Elena's bank account, payments that the prosecution claimed came from drug dealers, but which Elena knew were legitimate payments from a federal agency. She couldn't name without violating her confidentiality agreement. By the end of the first day, Elena felt emotionally drained. The prosecution had presented a compelling case that painted her as a corrupt lawyer who had betrayed her oath for money. The jury had heard testimony about leaked information, suspicious payments, and a pattern of behavior that seemed to prove her guilt beyond reasonable doubt. That evening, Elena sat in her small apartment, staring at the stack of legal documents that covered her dining table. Her phone had been ringing all day with calls from reporters and former colleagues, but she couldn't bring herself to answer. The weight of the accusations against her felt suffocating, and she found it hard to believe that just 6 months ago, she had been a respected public defender with a bright future ahead of her. The transformation had been swift and brutal. When Elena first discovered evidence of corruption in the district attorney's office, she had naively believed that reporting it through proper channels would lead to justice. Instead, she found herself caught in a web of lies and cover-ups that reached higher than she had ever imagined. It had started with the Marcus Williams case. Williams was a 22-year-old college student with no criminal record who had been arrested on drug trafficking charges. The evidence against him seemed overwhelming: drugs found in his apartment, witness testimony placing him at the scene of drug deals, and recorded phone conversations that appeared to show him coordinating sales. But as Elena reviewed the case file, she began to notice inconsistencies. The search warrant for Williams' apartment had been based on information from a confidential informant, but the affidavit contained details that didn't match the police reports. The witness testimony was suspiciously similar across multiple witnesses, as if they had been coached to tell the same story. And the recorded phone conversations contained gaps and cuts that suggested they had been edited. When Elena brought these concerns to the attention of the prosecutor assigned to the case, Assistant District Attorney James Morrison, Detective Morrison's younger brother, she was told that her questions were inappropriate, and that she should focus on providing her client with the best defense possible rather than second-guessing law enforcement. But Elena couldn't let it go. She had sworn an oath to zealously defend her clients, and that meant investigating every aspect of the case against them. As she dug deeper, she discovered that the confidential informant who had provided the information for the search warrant had a history of providing false information in exchange for money and reduced sentences on his own charges. The breakthrough came when Elena was able to track down one of the witnesses who had testified against Williams. The man, a small-time drug user named Tommy Valdez, broke down when Elena confronted him with evidence that his testimony was false. Through tears, he admitted that he had been pressured by police to lie about Williams in exchange for dropped charges on his own case. "They said they'd send me away for 10 years if I didn't cooperate," Valdez confessed during a recorded interview in Elena's office. "I didn't want to lie, but I was scared. They told me exactly what to say and when to say it." Armed with this evidence, Elena filed a motion to dismiss the charges against Williams, arguing that the prosecution's case was built on fabricated evidence and perjured testimony. The motion included Valdez's recorded confession and detailed analysis of the other evidence that Elena believed had been manipulated. The response from the district attorney's office was swift and vicious. Instead of investigating Elena's claims, they launched an investigation into Elena herself. Within weeks, she found herself under scrutiny for alleged ethical violations, including accusations that she had improperly contacted prosecution witnesses and that she had received payments from unknown sources. The unknown sources were the most damaging part of the accusations against her. Elena had indeed received payments, but they weren't from drug dealers, as the prosecution claimed. They were from a federal task force that had recruited her to help expose corruption within the local justice system. The payments were meant to compensate her for the risks she was taking and to provide her with resources to continue her investigation. But the task force operated under deep cover.
And Elena's handlers had made it clear that she could not reveal
her cooperation without compromising ongoing investigations. When the district attorney's office discovered the payments, they assumed the worst and used them as evidence of Elena's supposed corruption. The irony was bitter and complete. Elena's efforts to expose corruption had been used as evidence that she was corrupt. The very system she had tried to protect had turned against her with lethal efficiency. And now she found herself facing federal charges that could destroy her life. As Elena sat in her apartment that night, she thought about the choice she faced. She could reveal her cooperation with the federal task force, which might save her from conviction but would destroy ongoing investigations and potentially put other people at risk. Or she could maintain her silence and hope that her attorney could find another way to prove her innocence. The decision weighed heavily on her conscience. She had become a lawyer to fight for justice, but now she found herself in a position where any choice she made seemed to betray someone. If she revealed her federal cooperation, she would be betraying the agents who had trusted her in the ongoing investigation that could expose widespread corruption. If she remained silent, she would be betraying herself and her own future. The second day of trial brought more damaging testimony from the prosecution. A forensic accountant testified about the suspicious deposits in Elena's bank accounts, describing them as consistent with payments from criminal organizations. The accountant's testimony was technical and detailed, full of charts and graphs. That made Elena's financial situation look deeply suspicious. These deposits follow a pattern consistent with criminal activity, the accountant testified, pointing to a timeline projected on a screen for the jury to see. Large cash deposits, made at irregular intervals, often just below the reporting threshold for banks. This is a classic sign of money laundering. Elena wanted to scream that the deposits were legitimate payments from federal agents. But she remained silent, knowing that any outburst would only damage her case further. She watched the jury's faces as they absorbed the accountant's testimony, seeing the skepticism and suspicion growing in their eyes. During cross-examination, Chen did his best to challenge the accountant's conclusions, pointing out that the pattern could have innocent explanations. But without being able to reveal the true source of the payments, his questioning felt weak and ineffective. The prosecution's next witness was even more damaging. Dr. Sarah Martinez, forensic psychologist, testified about Elena's supposed psychological profile, describing her as someone with the personality traits associated with criminal behavior. Based on my evaluation, Dr. Martinez testified, Ms. Rodriguez exhibits several characteristics commonly found in individuals who engage in criminal activity. She shows a pattern of risk-taking behavior, a willingness to bend rules when it serves her purposes, and a sophisticated understanding of the legal system that would enable her to avoid detection. Elena was stunned by the audacity of the testimony. Dr. Martinez had never interviewed her or conducted any formal psychological evaluation. Yet she was offering expert opinion about Elena's character based solely on the prosecution's version of events. Chen objected vigorously to the testimony, arguing that it was prejudicial and based on insufficient evidence, but Judge Sullivan allowed most of it to stand. The message to the jury was clear. Elena Rodriguez was not just accused of criminal behavior. She was the type of person who would naturally engage in such behavior. As the prosecution continued to build their case, Elena found herself sinking deeper into despair. The evidence against her was entirely circumstantial, but it was being presented with such skill and conviction that it seemed to prove her guilt beyond doubt. The jury was hearing a carefully crafted narrative that painted her as a calculating criminal. She had no way to counter it without revealing information that could compromise ongoing federal investigations. The breaking point came during the testimony of Marcus Williams himself. The young man Elena had tried to defend took the stand as a prosecution witness, testifying that Elena had approached him about participating in a scheme to undermine drug prosecutions. "She told me she could help me beat the charges," Williams testified, his voice barely above a whisper, but that I'd have to help her with some things in return. She said she had connections with people who could make problems go away. Elena felt as if she had been punched in the stomach. Williams was lying under oath, and she couldn't understand why. She had risked everything to prove his innocence, and now he was helping to destroy her. She leaned over to whisper to Chen, but he held up a hand to silence her. During cross-examination, Chen tried to impeach Williams' testimony by pointing out inconsistencies in his story and highlighting the plea deal he had received from the prosecution in exchange for his cooperation, but the damage was done. The jury had heard from Elena's own former client that she had tried to recruit him into a criminal conspiracy. That evening, Elena finally broke down. The weight of the false accusations, the betrayal by her former client, and the hopelessness of her situation overwhelmed her. She sat on her couch, tears streaming down her face, as she contemplated the likelihood that she would spend the next decade in federal prison for crimes she had not committed. Her phone rang, and she almost didn't answer it. But when she saw that it was Chen, she forced herself to pick up. Elena. Chen's voice was urgent. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Is there anything at all that you haven't told me about your case? Any evidence or information that might help us? Elena hesitated, the weight of her silence pressing down on her like a physical force. She thought about the federal agents who had recruited her, the dangerous investigation she had been part of, and the ongoing operations that her revelation might compromise. I can't, she whispered into the phone. I'm sorry, Michael, but I can't tell you everything. There are other people involved, other investigations. If I reveal what I know, it could put people in danger. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Chen spoke again, his voice was heavy with resignation. Elena, I understand that you want to protect other people, but you need to understand what we're facing here. The prosecution has built a compelling case against you, and without some way to counter their narrative, you're going to be convicted. Is whatever you're protecting worth spending 20 years in prison? Elena closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the impossible choice she faced. She thought about the federal agents who had trusted her, the ongoing investigations that could expose corruption throughout the justice system, and the potential consequences of revealing her cooperation. But she also thought about her own life, her career, and her future. I need time to think, she said finally. Can you give me until tomorrow morning? Of course, Chen replied, but Elena, tomorrow is when we start presenting our defense. There's something that can help us. We need to know about it soon. After hanging up, Elena sat in her apartment staring at the lights of the city outside her window. Somewhere out there, federal agents were working to expose the very corruption that had led to her current predicament. They were counting on her silence to protect their investigation. But that silence might cost her everything. The third day of trial began with the prosecution resting their case. They had presented a methodical and damaging array of evidence that painted Elena as a corrupt lawyer who had sold her services to drug dealers. The circumstantial evidence was compelling, and the witness testimony had been devastating. As Chen rose to present the opening of their defense, Elena still hadn't decided whether to reveal her federal cooperation. She watched her attorney approach the jury, knowing that he was about to fight for her freedom with incomplete information about her case. Ladies and gentlemen, Chen began, his voice carrying a conviction that Elena wished she felt. The prosecution has painted a picture of Elena Rodriguez as a criminal, but that picture is fundamentally false. What you have heard over the past 2 days is a carefully constructed narrative designed to hide the truth about what really happened. Chen's opening was passionate and well-crafted, but Elena could see that it lacked the specificity and detail that would come from knowing the full truth about her situation. He spoke in general terms about prosecutorial misconduct and the possibility that Elena was being framed, but he couldn't provide the concrete evidence that would prove his claims. The defense's first witness was Dr. Robert Kim, forensic accountant, who had reviewed Elena's financial records. Dr. Kim testified that the deposits in Elena's accounts were consistent with legitimate payments for consulting work. But without being able to reveal the true source of the payments, his testimony felt weak and unconvincing. Dr. Kim Chen asked, "In your professional opinion, could these deposits have come from legitimate sources?" "Absolutely," Dr. Kim replied. "The pattern and timing of these deposits is consistent with consulting fees, legal work, or other professional services. There's nothing inherently suspicious about them." But during cross-examination, Blackstone systematically dismantled Dr. Kim's testimony, pointing out that he had no evidence of what Elena's supposed consulting work involved or who had paid her for it. Dr. Kim, Blackstone asked, his voice dripping with skepticism, "You testified that these deposits could represent legitimate consulting fees, But isn't it true that you have no idea what Ms. Rodriguez was supposedly consulting about? That's correct, Dr. Kim admitted. I don't have specific information about the nature of the work. And you have no documentation showing who supposedly paid her these fees? No, I don't. So your testimony is based purely on speculation about what these payments might have been, rather than any concrete evidence. Dr. Kim shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I can only testify about the financial patterns I observed. The interpretation of those patterns is for the jury to decide. Elena watched in frustration as her defense crumbled under Blackstone's aggressive cross-examination. Without being able to reveal the truth about her federal cooperation, Chen was fighting with one hand tied behind his back. The defense's next witness was Dr. Patricia Gonzalez, forensic psychologist who had actually interviewed Elena and conducted a proper psychological evaluation. Dr. Gonzalez testified that Elena showed no signs of criminal thinking or behavior, contradicting the prosecution's expert witness. In my professional opinion, Dr. Gonzalez testified, Rodriguez demonstrates a strong moral compass and a deep commitment to ethical behavior. Her psychological profile is entirely inconsistent with someone who would engage in criminal activity. Again, Blackstone's cross-examination was devastating. He pointed out that psychological evaluations couldn't predict future behavior, and that many criminals appeared normal to those around them. As the defense case continued, Elena could see that they were losing ground. Without the key evidence that would prove her innocence, her cooperation with federal law enforcement, Chen was unable to provide the jury with a compelling alternative narrative to the prosecution's case. The courtroom was tense as Chen called his final witness, Elena herself. Taking the stand in her own defense was a risky move, but it was their last chance to humanize her and tell her side of the story. Elena walked to the witness stand with as much dignity as she could muster, knowing that her testimony could determine the outcome of the trial. She placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. The irony of the moment not lost on her. She was swearing to tell the truth while being forced to conceal the most important truth of all. Double quotes, Ms. Rodriguez. Chen began gently. Please tell the jury about your background and why you became a public defender. Elena's voice was steady as she spoke about her childhood in the Bronx, her parents' struggles as immigrants, and her decision to dedicate her career to defending those who couldn't afford expensive lawyers. She spoke about her belief in the justice system and her commitment to ensuring that everyone received fair representation, regardless of their background or the charges against them. I became a public defender because I believe that everyone deserves a zealous advocate, Elena testified, her eyes moving across the jury. I've never been motivated by money or personal gain. My only goal has always been to ensure that my clients receive fair treatment under the law. Chen led her through her version of events, allowing her to explain how she had discovered inconsistencies in the Marcus Williams case and how she had tried to investigate them through proper channels. Elena testified about the pressure she had faced to drop her investigation and the sudden scrutiny she had come under when she refused to back down. When you received these payments that the prosecution has characterized as criminal, Chen asked, what was your understanding of their source? Elena hesitated, knowing that her answer would be crucial but that she couldn't tell the complete truth. I believe they were legitimate payments for legal consulting work, she said carefully. I reported them on my tax returns and deposited them in my regular bank account. There was nothing secretive or suspicious about them. It was technically true, but Elena knew that her evasiveness would be apparent to the jury. She was telling the truth as far as she could, but she wasn't telling the whole truth. Everyone in the courtroom could sense it. Blackstone's cross-examination was brutal and methodical. He attacked every aspect of Elena's testimony, pointing out inconsistencies and evasions in her answers. He pressed her repeatedly about the source of the payments, forcing her to invoke attorney-client privilege and other legal protections to avoid answering directly. Ms. Rodriguez, Blackstone asked, his voice cold and prosecutorial. Isn't it true that you can't tell this jury where these payments came from because they came from drug dealers? No, that's not true, Elena replied firmly, but she could see the skepticism in the jurors' eyes. Please explain to the jury exactly who paid you these substantial sums of money. Elena felt trapped. knowing that any answer she gave would either be perjury or would compromise ongoing federal investigations. "I'm not able to discuss the details of confidential legal work," she said finally, knowing how weak it sounded. Blackstone pounced on her evasiveness. "So you want this jury to believe that you received tens of thousands of dollars for mysterious confidential legal work that you can't describe? From clients you can't name, for purposes you can't explain?" Elena felt the noose tightening around her neck. The payments were legitimate, she insisted. But she could see that the jury didn't believe her. As Elena stepped down from the witness stand, she knew that her testimony had likely sealed her fate. Without being able to reveal the truth about her federal cooperation, she had appeared evasive and dishonest. Confirming the prosecution's portrayal of her as someone with something to hide, the closing arguments were a formality. Blackstone delivered a masterful summation that tied together all the evidence against Elena, painting her as a calculating criminal who had betrayed her oath for money. His voice rang with conviction as he asked the jury to hold Elena accountable for her crimes. "Ladies and gentlemen," Blackstone declared, his voice carrying throughout the packed courtroom, "the evidence in this case is overwhelming. Elena Rodriguez used her position as a public defender to enrich herself at the expense of justice. She sold information to drug dealers, undermined law enforcement investigations, and corrupted the very system she swore to uphold. The defendant has had every opportunity to explain her actions, but instead, she has offered you evasions and half-truths. I ask you to find her guilty on all counts." Chin's closing argument was passionate, but felt hollow in the face of the prosecution's evidence. He spoke about reasonable doubt and the possibility of prosecutorial misconduct. But without concrete evidence to support his claims, his words lacked the power to overcome the prosecution's narrative. As the jury filed out to begin their deliberations, Elena felt a crushing sense of despair. She had been unable to tell her side of the story, unable to defend herself properly, and unable to prove her innocence without betraying the federal agents who had trusted her. The system she had dedicated her life to defending had turned against her, and now she faced the very real possibility of spending decades in prison for crimes she had not committed. The jury deliberated for 2 days, and each hour felt like an eternity to Elena. She sat in the conference room adjacent to the courtroom, staring at the walls and trying to prepare herself for the inevitable guilty verdict. Chen tried to remain optimistic, pointing out that lengthy deliberations sometimes favored the defense. But Elena could see the doubt in his eyes. On the morning of the 3rd day, word came that the jury had reached a verdict. Elena's hands trembled as she walked back into the courtroom, knowing that the next few minutes would determine the course of the rest of her life. The gallery was packed with spectators, reporters, and court personnel. All eager to see the conclusion of the high-profile trial, Judge Sullivan entered the courtroom with her usual stern expression, and the jury filed in with faces that revealed nothing about their decision. Elena tried to read their body language, searching for any sign of sympathy or doubt, but they avoided her gaze. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Sullivan asked. The jury foreman, a middle-aged man with graying hair and kind eyes, stood slowly. "We have, Your Honor. Please hand the verdict to the bailiff." Elena watched in slow motion as the bailiff carried the folded paper from the jury box to the judge's bench. Judge Sullivan unfolded the verdict, read it silently, and then handed it back to the bailiff, who returned it to the foreman. "Will the defendant please rise?" Elena stood on unsteady legs, Chen beside her, as she prepared to hear the words that would either free her or destroy her life. The courtroom was absolutely silent, the tension so thick it seemed to have physical weight. "In the matter of United States of America versus Elena Rodriguez," the foreman began, his voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom, "on the count of conspiracy, we find the defendant." But before he could finish, the courtroom doors burst open with a sound like thunder. Elena turned to see a tall man in a dark suit striding purposefully down the center aisle, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor with military precision. Behind him followed 2 other figures, their faces grim and determined. "Your Honor," the man called out, his voice cutting through the stunned silence. "I'm Deputy Attorney General Marcus Thompson. I need to speak with the court immediately regarding this case. Judge Sullivan's gavel came down hard. This is highly irregular, Mr. Thompson. This court is in the middle of reading a verdict. Thompson approached the bench, pulling out a leather credential case and displaying it to the judge. Your Honor, I have new evidence that directly relates to this case and the charges against Ms. Rodriguez. This evidence comes from an ongoing federal investigation and has immediate bearing on these proceedings. Elena felt her heart racing as she watched the scene unfold before her. The Deputy Attorney General's sudden appearance was unprecedented, and the shock on everyone's face, sus including Judge Sullivan's, was palpable. Your Honor, Thompson continued, his voice carrying absolute authority. I must inform the court that Ms. Elena Rodriguez has been operating as a confidential informant for the Department of Justice for the past 8 months. The charges against her are based on evidence that was part of her undercover assignment to expose corruption within the district attorney's office. The courtroom erupted in gasps and murmurs. Elena saw Blackstone's face drain of color while District Attorney Hawthorne looked as if she had been struck by lightning. The jury members exchanged confused glances, clearly struggling to process this unexpected development. Judge Sullivan banged her gavel repeatedly, trying to restore order. This is highly unusual, Mr. Thompson. Are you saying that this trial has been conducted without knowledge of Ms. Rodriguez's cooperation with federal law enforcement? That's exactly what I'm saying, Your Honor, Thompson replied, his voice cutting through the chaos. Ms. Rodriguez was recruited by our office to help expose a conspiracy involving evidence tampering, witness intimidation, and prosecutorial misconduct. The very crimes she's been accused of committing were actually part of her assignment to gather evidence against the real perpetrators. Elena felt tears streaming down her face as the truth finally came to light. The months of silence, the impossible choice between her freedom and her duty, anguish of watching her reputation be destroyed. It was all finally over. Thompson turned to address the courtroom, his presence commanding absolute attention. Ladies and gentlemen, what you have witnessed in this trial is not the prosecution of a corrupt lawyer, but the attempted cover-up of a conspiracy that reaches into the highest levels of local law enforcement and prosecution. He gestured toward the prosecution table, where Blackstone sat frozen in his chair. Assistant United States Attorney Blackstone was aware of Ms. Rodriguez's cooperation from the beginning. His prosecution of this case was not an attempt to seek justice, but an effort to silence a federal informant who had gathered evidence of widespread corruption. The revelation hit the courtroom like a physical blow. Lena watched as the pieces fell into place for everyone present. The suspicious payments, the mysterious consulting work, the evasive testimony, it all made sense now that the truth was revealed. Thompson continued his shocking disclosure. Over the past 8 months, Ms. Rodriguez has helped our office uncover evidence of a conspiracy involving planted evidence, coerced testimony, and the systematic framing of innocent defendants. The Marcus Williams case, which first raised Ms. Rodriguez's suspicions, is just one example of a pattern of corruption that has been ongoing for years. District Attorney Hawthorne finally found her voice, standing unsteadily at the prosecution table. Your Honor, this is preposterous. I was never informed of any federal investigation involving my office. If Ms. Rodriguez was working with federal agents, why wasn't this disclosed during discovery? Thompson's smile was cold and professional. Because Ms. Hawthorne, you are one of the primary targets of our investigation. The evidence Ms. Rodriguez gathered shows that you were directly involved in the conspiracy to frame innocent defendants and cover up police misconduct. The courtroom exploded in chaos. Porters frantically scribbled notes, spectators shouted questions, and court personnel struggled to maintain order. Elena sat in stunned silence, hardly able to believe that her nightmare was finally ending. Judge Sullivan's gavel echoed repeatedly as she fought to regain control. Order! I will have order in this courtroom. When the noise finally subsided, Thompson approached the bench and handed Judge Sullivan a thick manila folder. Your Honor, this contains evidence gathered during Ms. Rodriguez's undercover assignment. Recorded conversations, doctored police reports, and financial records showing payments made to silence witnesses and cover up misconduct. Elena watched as Judge Sullivan reviewed the documents, her expression growing increasingly grim. After several minutes, the judge looked up at the courtroom, her face reflecting the weight of what she had just learned. "Mr. Thompson," Judge Sullivan said, her voice heavy with the implications, "are you requesting that this court dismiss all charges against Ms. Rodriguez?" "I am, Your Honor. Furthermore, I am here to inform the court that federal arrest warrants have been issued for several individuals involved in this conspiracy." Thompson turned to face the prosecution table, his voice carrying the full authority of the federal government. "Patricia Hawthorne, you are under arrest for conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and violations of civil rights under color of law." Federal agents who had been waiting outside the courtroom entered and approached the prosecution table. Lena watched in disbelief as handcuffs were placed on District Attorney Hawthorne, the woman who had made her life a living hell for the past 6 months. "Richard Blackstone," Thompson continued, "you are also under arrest for conspiracy and obstruction of justice." Elena felt a surge of vindication as she watched Blackstone, the man who had painted her as a criminal being, led away in handcuffs. The irony was complete. The prosecutors who had accused her of corruption were themselves corrupt. Judge Sullivan addressed the jury, her voice steady, despite the extraordinary circumstances. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, in light of these revelations, this court is dismissing all charges against Elena Rodriguez with prejudice. I are dismissed from service, and I thank you for your time." The jury members filed out, many of them shaking their heads in amazement at the turn of events. Elena remained seated at the defense table, still struggling to process what had just happened. Thompson approached her, his expression softening for the first time since entering the courtroom. "Ms. Rodriguez, I want to personally apologize for what you've been through. Your cooperation has been invaluable to our investigation, and your courage in maintaining your cover despite the personal cost has helped us expose a conspiracy that could have continued to harm innocent people for years." Elena found her voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "Why did you wait so long? I was about to be convicted." Thompson's expression grew serious. "We had to be absolutely certain of our evidence before revealing your cooperation. If we had moved too soon, other conspirators might have escaped justice. I know it was an impossible burden to place on you, but your sacrifice has resulted in the exposure of corruption that reaches far beyond what we initially suspected." Over the following days, the full scope of the conspiracy began to emerge. Elena's undercover work had helped federal investigators uncover a systematic pattern of corruption, involving dozens of cases over several years. Police officers had planted evidence, witnesses had been coerced into giving false testimony, and prosecutors had knowingly used perjured testimony to secure convictions. The Marcus Williams case, which had first alerted Elena to the conspiracy, turned out to be just the tip of the iceberg. Williams himself had been threatened into testifying against Elena, and when the truth came out, he publicly apologized for his role in the attempted frame-up. "I was scared," Williams admitted during a televised interview. "They told me that if I didn't testify against Ms. Rodriguez, they would make sure I got the maximum sentence. I'm sorry I doubted her. She was the only one trying to help me when everyone else had given up." Elena's vindication was complete, but the emotional toll of her ordeal would take time to heal. She had spent months believing that her career and her life were over, watching as people she had trusted turned against her and painted her as a criminal. The revelation that she had been working undercover for the federal government restored her reputation. But it couldn't erase the trauma of what she had endured. In the weeks following the trial, Elena was approached by numerous job offers from prestigious law firms and government agencies. Her story had made national news. She was being hailed as a hero who had risked everything to expose corruption and protect innocent defendants. But Elena found herself struggling with the decision of what to do next. The experience had shaken her faith in the justice system, even as it had ultimately vindicated her. She had seen how easily the truth could be twisted, how quickly reputations could be destroyed, and how the system could be manipulated by those in power. 3 months after the trial, Elena stood once again in front of the federal courthouse where her ordeal had played out. This time, she was there voluntarily, meeting with Deputy Attorney General Thompson to to discuss her future role in ongoing investigations. "We'd like you to consider a permanent position with the Department of Justice," Thompson said as they sat. In his temporary office, your experience as a public defender, combined with your proven ability to work undercover, makes you invaluable for investigating corruption in local justice systems. Elena looked out the window at the city below, thinking about all the defendants who might be facing the same kind of systematic persecution she had uncovered. "What kind of position?" "Special Attorney for Civil Rights Enforcement," Thompson replied. "You'd be responsible for investigating complaints of prosecutorial misconduct, police corruption, and civil rights violations. It would be dangerous work there. Are powerful people who would prefer that these investigations never happen, but it would also be meaningful work." Elena thought about her experience, about the months of silence and the impossible choices she had faced. She thought about Marcus Williams and all the other innocent people who had been framed by corrupt officials. She thought about the justice system she had dedicated her life to serving and how it could be redeemed. "I'll do it," she said finally. "But with one condition." "What's that?" "I want to focus on reforming the system, not just punishing the corrupt. We need to create safeguards that prevent this kind of conspiracy from happening again." Thompson smiled and extended his hand. "Deal." As Elena shook his hand, she felt a sense of purpose returning to her life. The ordeal she had endured had been terrible, but it had also given her unique insight into how the system could fail and how it could be fixed. She would use that knowledge to ensure that other innocent people wouldn't have to suffer as she had. 6 months later, Elena stood before a congressional committee investigating corruption in local justice systems. Her testimony helped lead to significant reforms in how prosecutors handle cases and how law enforcement agencies are overseen. "The system failed me," she told the committee. "But more importantly, it failed countless innocent defendants who didn't have the resources or the federal backing to fight back. We need to ensure that what happened to me never happens to anyone else." The 8th story had been revealed, and with it came a powerful lesson about the importance of courage in the face of corruption. Elena Rodriguez had risked everything to expose the truth, and though the cost had been enormous, the result was a justice system that was stronger and more accountable. Her story became a symbol of how one person's courage could make a difference even when facing impossible odds. Law schools began teaching courses on prosecutorial ethics, using her case as an example. And her experience became a catalyst for reforms that would protect future generations of defendants. Elena continued her work with the Department of Justice, investigating corruption and fighting for reform. She never forgot the months when she stood alone against a corrupt system, and she used that experience to fuel her passion for justice. The courtroom where her trial had taken place now bore a small plaque commemorating the case that had exposed one of the largest corruption scandals in the city's history. It served as a reminder that justice, while sometimes delayed, would ultimately prevail when good people had the courage to stand up for what was right. Years later, when Elena would speak to young lawyers about ethics and integrity, she would always end with the same message: the system is only as strong as the people who serve it. When we see corruption, we have a duty to expose it, no matter the personal cost. Because the alternative, allowing injustice to flourish, is far worse than any risk we might face. The 8th story had taught everyone involved that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons or wealth, but with truth and courage. Elena Rodriguez had embodied those values when it mattered most, and in doing so, she had made the justice system stronger for everyone. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey of courage, corruption, and ultimate vindication. Elena Rodriguez's story reminds us that even when the system seems stacked against us, truth and justice can prevail if we have the courage to stand up for what's right. If this story moved you, take a moment to consider the importance of integrity in our institutions and the courage required to expose corruption when we encounter it. Sometimes the most important battles are fought by ordinary people who refuse to stay silent in the face of injustice. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue sharing stories that matter, stories that challenge us to be better and to demand better from our institutions. Together, we can build a community that values truth, justice, and the courage to stand up for what's right. Because sometimes, Eighth Story reveals that the most important victories are won not by the powerful, but by those who refuse to be silenced when they witness wrongdoing. And sometimes the person who changes everything is the one who everyone thought they could safely ignore.